In the November 2022 midterm elections, thousands of Asian American voters were surveyed as part of AALDEF's national multilingual exit poll. The exit poll, the largest nonpartisan survey of its kind in the nation, was conducted in multiple cities across 9 states, including Texas.
I want to introduce Jerry Vattamala. Jerry Vattamala has been we joke around, but literally AALDEF has been the attorney for the Asian American community and filed lawsuits representing various organizations across the country to protect voting rights. Years back, there were kids that were literally being bullied and beat up in their high school in Philadelphia, and AALDEF was the organization that stepped up and partnered with our chapter in Philly to help those kids get something, some kind of resolution or from their school, principal, right? Just to get their voice heard. And so Jerry is the director of, this is called the Democracy Project, which has been going on since 1988. It's a national survey. It's the only survey of its kind that does exit surveys on election day, as well as protecting the right for people to vote, and documenting when and where Asian Americans may face discrimination or being turned away from being able to exercise their right to vote. So thank you to Jerry for literally coming to Texas every other year. So it's pretty much on this cycle, right? On the even year, last year 2022, we do the survey, we recruit volunteers to come and organize and essentially conduct the exit survey, and then in the odd year, the next year, Jerry literally comes down and goes around the country, doing the presentation on what were the results, right? Both nationally as well as what are the results for us. Texas being the state that it is, we are a large state and we are an important state. I like to emphasize what happens in Texas reflects the rest of the country. So with that, thank you so much, Jerry, for coming here.
Yeah, we did this presentation in Houston last night. In the afternoon, we were in Austin, and now we're here in Dallas to do this presentation. So thank you, Debbie, and thank you, OCA Dallas DFW chapter, for hosting us and putting this together. I want to just give you a little bit of background of what is this survey, right? Why did we do it? We started in 1988. One of the reasons that we started in 1988 was because Asian American voters have traditionally been ignored by the national media, right? And you've probably seen this when you're watching the TV or anything in the days and weeks and months leading up to an election. They'll usually give you the polling data, right? Whites are voting this way, blacks are voting this way, Latinos are voting this way, and other, right? Asian Americans are excluded. Now the harm with that is that the candidates, elected representatives, and the parties then have no idea about the electorate. Who is the Asian American electorate? What about the different ethnic groups, right? Or the differences among the ethnic groups? Are they identifying as Republicans or Democrats or not enrolled or not affiliated? Who are they voting for in these elections, right? What are the top issues that are important to them? If they don't know the electorate and they don't know what issues are important to the community, they're not going to be able to respond to the needs of the community, right? So that's one of the things we're trying to do here. We want to capture the demographic data and the electoral data and publish that, bolster it into the national media so that the candidates, the elected officials, and the parties will then know more about the electorate and who we're voting for, the issues that are important to us, and ultimately we want them to respond to those issues. So that's one aspect, capturing that data, right, from Asian American voters, demographic and electoral. The other aspect, which is really cool about this program, is that it's real-time voter protection. So if a voter has a problem on election day, we do a training beforehand so that our volunteers know what to do if there's a problem, right? If a voter has a problem, the goal of this project is to remedy that problem right there in real time on election day at the poll site. Because usually if you lose your right to vote on election day, it's gone forever, right? You're not going to redo the election. So that's the other aspect, real time voter protection. All right. The way this program works, for those of you, can I see a show of hands? Who did this program before? We have a few, okay, a couple people. The way this works is that we are stationed outside of poll sites where we know there's a large number of Asian American voters. We are there with clipboards with our surveys, after voters have finished voting or have been denied the right to vote and they're exiting the poll site, we will approach the Asian American voters and ask them to complete the survey. That's the way this program works, right? And we ask a whole bunch of questions. It's usually about 22, 23 questions. We have demographic and electoral questions and substantive questions. So why don't we look at a little bit of the data. I want to tell you briefly a little bit about AALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. We were founded in 1974. We are a national organization. Our headquarters are in New York, but we're national. So we'll come to Texas, we'll go to Michigan, we'll go to all the different places around the country where we're needed. Our mission is to protect the civil rights of Asian Americans. Right? We do that through litigation. Litigation are these lawsuits that Debbie was talking about. It's also education, organizing, and advocacy within the community. We're trying to empower the community. And we have different program areas here. I'm the director of the democracy program, which is voting rights. But we also do other work in economic justice, immigrants' rights, workers' rights, housing. I brought a case in Philadelphia on behalf of Chinese takeout restaurants. They were being targeted for a city ordinance, and only that demographic was being targeted, right? 99% of the tickets for this ordinance were against Chinese takeout restaurants. We were able to get relief for them. So we do a bunch of different areas. So if anyone is interested in volunteering with us, you don't need to be an attorney. And you can, in any of these program areas, you can volunteer with us. And next year, actually, will be our 50th anniversary. We were founded in 1974, and we're really glad to partner with OCA for all these years. We started, as Debbie mentioned, in 1988 in Manhattan's Chinatown, and we've expanded every year since. So in certain years, there were 14 states in Washington, D.C. 2022, I just realized this pointer doesn't work on the screen. That's interesting. Okay. So we were in 12 states in Washington, D.C. The 7 states that we're talking about up there that we list, that was for poll monitoring. Poll monitoring was a little bit different. That's where we had teams of attorneys inside poll sites where people were actually voting and observing what was going on to make sure that there was no discrimination. So we had that also going on in those 7 states, but we were also doing the exit poll in those 7 states plus 12 additional states. Okay. So we were around the country. We had over 5,000, you see there, 5,476 Asian American voters that we surveyed across the country. As Debbie mentioned, it's the largest survey of its kind. Every jurisdiction that we're in, we write a follow-up letter letting them know what the results were, right? What's the demographics of your poll site? What are the language needs, right? And how you can make your elections better to serve the Asian American community. All right, this presentation is only going to focus on Texas. Our national presentation is on our website, and you see over the 5,000, almost 5,500 voters, we have a presentation for the national where we combine all the results. This presentation tonight is only about Texas. You see we had almost about 600 voters that we surveyed. We were in several different areas. We were in the Harris, Fort Bend area, Dallas, Travis, and Collin County. Right, and you can see here over 100 voters in Dallas, close to 100 in Collin County, right, that we surveyed. For the entirety of Texas, of the 600 voters that we surveyed, you can see here, Vietnamese was the largest in Texas, 39%, followed by Asian Indian, 29%. 19% was Chinese. The other there in the green, there were several other ethnic groups that we had about 3%, so we sort of combined them into the other. That was Filipino, Korean, and Pakistani. That's what the other made most of these. If you look here at the bottom, nativity, we asked on that survey, were you native born? Were you born in this country, or were you foreign born naturalized citizen? Right? Big number here. There, 83% of the close to 600 voters that we surveyed in Texas, 83% were foreign born naturalized citizens, which is pretty consistent with nationally what the number was. Very large number of foreign born naturalized citizens. Here we are by ethnicity, right? So here in Dallas, a very large portion of the voters that we surveyed, we were at a Vietnamese American community center, right? So very large percentage, 93% of the voters that we surveyed there in Dallas were Vietnamese American. In Frisco, you see 73% were Asian Indian, right? So it really depends where we are. There's a big difference in who we surveyed. And this doesn't necessarily mean that's all of the voters in that entire area. It just so happened at the poll sites that we were at, right? And we rely on community folks to tell us the best poll sites. We're trying to capture be at the poll sites where we have the largest number of Asian American voters. And when we say Asian American, it's a very broad term. It's basically what the census says. East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian. We're trying to capture all of these different ethnic groups that identify as Asian. We also capture voters that identify as Arab American, but there wasn't that much of a large population in the poll sites that we were at in Texas. You see Sugar Land has more of a mix of Vietnamese, Chinese, Asian, Indian, and other. In Austin, you had a large proportion of, again, Asian, Indian, Chinese, and not so much of the Vietnamese population there. So it really depends where we are. But here in Dallas, very large proportion that were Vietnamese. First-time voters, a little bit lower than in presidential. Usually you'll see in the midterm elections you have a lower percentage of first-time voters. These are usually voters that have voted already in past elections. So pretty close to what the national average was. In presidential, you'll see that number go up a few percentage points. We asked on our survey, how well do you speak English? Okay, now our survey, I want to point out, it's in English and it's also translated into 11 different Asian languages. So we had our survey in Vietnamese, in Chinese, in different Asian Indian languages, so that the folks that are limited English proficient were able to fill out the survey in their own language. That's very different from most national polling is not done in language. Right? It's not translated. Well, what does this term mean, limited English proficient? Well, it's defined, it's a legal term. It's defined as when you ask the person the question, how well do you speak English? The choices are very well, not well, and not at all. It's right there at the bottom. Any response less than very well is considered limited English proficient. So anything to the right of the green, right? Green is very well, to the right of the green is considered limited English proficient. What that means is these are all US citizens that are eligible to vote, but they're limited English proficient, LEP. So that means they're usually going to need some type of language assistance, right? They're going to either need some language assistance provided by the jurisdiction, or they'll have to bring somebody with them if it's not provided, right? And you'll see here in Texas, to the right of the green, so it's 43%. 43% of all the voters that we surveyed here in Texas were LEP. It's a very large number, almost half, right? And when you break it down by ethnic group, you see the Vietnamese community, almost 3/4, 74% were LEP, limited English proficient, right? So that community is really going to need some type of language assistance. And then you look at the top, Filipino, Pakistani, Asian, Indian, very small LEP number, right? Those voters will likely not need language assistance. All right, we're going to cover a little bit later this term. It's also, it doesn't show up on the screen, I think. See? Or it disappears or something.
Yeah, it's too bright, yeah.
So this legal term, they asked this question on the American Community Survey. Has anyone heard of that, the American Community Survey? Okay, it used to be called the long form census. That's sent out every year to a sample of a geographic jurisdiction, right? So
It's still too bright, I think the screen itself.
yeah. So they asked that question, how well do you speak English, on the American Community Survey, and they ask a few other questions that are more detailed than the decennial census. But hopefully all of you filled out the census a few years ago. So they use this data, and there's a provision of the Voting Rights Act that says if you have 10,000 people or 5% of the voting jurisdiction, whichever is smaller, that is citizen, voting age, limited English proficient, LEP, and the rate of illiteracy is higher than the national average within that language group, then that language group can be covered under the Federal Voting Rights Act. It's called Section 203. And what that means is if a language is covered for a jurisdiction, then every piece of voting material that's in English has to be translated into that covered language. So this was not originally part of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. 10 years later, in 1975, they amended the Voting Rights Act to include protections for what they called language minority voters. And it's only certain language minority voters. These are, again, US citizens eligible to vote, but English is not their native language. So it only applies to Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Alaskan Natives. Only those 4 language groups. Okay, Congress had conducted hearings and found that these language minority voters had suffered multi-jurisdictional discrimination, meaning the discrimination wasn't localized to one county or one state, it was in multiple places around the country. So if you're Asian, Latino, Native American, Alaskan Native, and you can satisfy those requirements, 10,000 people or 5%, citizen, voting age, LEP, and illiterate, then your language group can be covered. Now, the director of the Census Bureau every 5 years comes out with a new list. Right? So in Texas, we're going to cover this in a second. We have 3 counties that are covered under Section 203. For a long time, it was only Harris County. Harris County in the Houston area was covered for Chinese and Vietnamese. And then in 2016, Tarrant County was covered for Vietnamese. And just recently, in 2021, Dallas County is now covered for Vietnamese. And it makes sense, right? Look at Vietnamese has the highest LEP rate, right? So every piece of voting material, voter registration form, the vote here sign, no electioneering. What do you think the most important piece of voting material is on election day? What would you say?
Ballot.
Ballot has to be translated. Right? And they have to also provide oral language assistance. So that's only if you're covered. So there's a list that is put out every 5 years. Only if you're on the list are you required under federal law to do that. Nothing stops a jurisdiction from voluntarily providing language assistance. You could translate if you'd like. You can provide interpreters if you'd like, but you're only required to do it if you're under Section 203. And so far in Texas, that's only Harris, Tarrant, and Dallas right now. While we're on the topic, I do want to mention this too. What happens if you're an LEP voter and you're not covered? You don't speak one of the languages that is covered. Let's say you're an Asian Indian voter. What do you do? Right? There's another provision of the Voting Rights Act. Right? It's called Section 208. This was amended later in 1982. So 7 years after they included this provision, they said if you cannot see the ballot, you cannot physically mark the ballot, or you can't read the ballot. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is you can't read the ballot. So if you're illiterate or you're LEP, you can't understand the ballot, Section 208 applies. And what that says is that you can bring any person of your choice inside the voting booth with you to assist you to see the ballot, mark the ballot, or read the ballot so you can understand. The only restriction is that the person you bring with you cannot be your boss or union rep. They're going to tell you who to vote for. You're going to feel pressure to do that, right? So it can't be your boss or union rep, but it could be anybody else. Who do you think most Asian American LEP voters will bring with them inside the voting booth to understand the ballot?
Children, the kids.
Almost always they're minor children or grandchildren, right? So that's much easier to comply with, right? So if you're covered under Section 203, a jurisdiction has to translate everything, they have to get interpreters. It's understandably a lot of work, admittedly a lot of work. Section 208 is pretty easy, right, in most people's opinion. You just allow a voter to be assisted by a person of their choice as long as it's not their boss or union rep. Now, the reason I bring this up is because we said before only 3 counties in Texas are covered, right? And we have so many other voters. Even if you're in a covered jurisdiction, you might not speak that covered language, right? So we rely very heavily on Section 208 across the country, right? There's much more Spanish language coverage across the entire country. The entire state of Texas is covered for Spanish, right? But we only have 3 counties, so Section 208, bringing somebody with you is very important for our community. Now, in 2014, we had a South Asian voter in the Austin area, in Williamson County, and she wanted to vote with the assistance of her son, who was a student at UT Austin in Travis County. Texas had a state election code that said all interpreters must be a registered voter in the county in which they're providing their services. I just asked you a moment ago, who do you think most Asian American LEP voters bring? Their children. Can a minor be a registered voter? No, you have to be over 18, right? 18 or over. So big problem for our community, and that's what happened to this South Asian voter. She was LEP, she needed assistance, and they asked her son, oh, your son's gonna interpret the ballot for you? Are you registered in Williamson County? No, I'm registered in Travis County where you go to school. Sorry, can't help you, Mom. Right? So we actually brought a lawsuit on behalf of that voter and OCA Greater Houston because OCA members, many of them fit that profile. They would need assistance. So we brought that lawsuit in 2015. It happened to be the 50th anniversary of the Federal Voting Rights Act, August 6, 2015. We brought that lawsuit in federal court. And during the course of the litigation, the lawsuit, unfortunately, that South Asian woman, she passed away. Mm-hmm. I have to tell you, she's very brave. When we did the presentation in Austin during lunchtime earlier today, we actually had 2 people that knew her. Right? And I have to tell you, we had to really, I wouldn't say twist her arm, but sort of nudge her to be willing to bring the lawsuit. could you imagine, even if you're someone that's born here in English proficient, it's daunting, scary, to say, Jerry Vattamala versus the state of Texas, right? So now she's an immigrant, naturalized citizen, just only started recently voting, and limited English proficient. But she had the courage to say her name was Malika Das, an OCA Greater Houston versus the state of Texas. Right? Unfortunately, she passed away, and then our only remaining plaintiff was OCA Greater Houston. Right? So we continue with the lawsuit. Debbie spoke at one of the court hearings, right, to make sure that OCA had what we call legal standing, that their members actually were going to be harmed by the state election code. We won. Right? We won at the district court level. We went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a very conservative circuit court. We won there. We got attorney's fees, which was nice, and we had a permanent injunction. That means the state of Texas was permanently prohibited from infringing on this right to bring somebody with you inside the voting booth. The reason I want to tell you this is you may have heard of SB 1, Senate Bill 1, right? And we heard about the provisions. Some provisions, not all provisions, but certain provisions we knew really would affect our community. One of those provisions was that if you were going to be an interpreter, you were required to take an oath. And part of this oath said, I will restrict my assistance to purely translating what it says on the ballot and nothing more. Anything more, and you're subject to criminal prosecution. You could potentially go to jail. If any of you have ever helped somebody translate the ballot, when you translate, district attorney, county judge, or any of these terms that they're not used to hearing, what do they say? Well, what does that mean? Yeah. What does that mean? Can you tell me what this means? If you were to explain under a Senate Bill 1, you could be prosecuted, you could potentially go to jail. Right? So we went back to the judge that issued the permanent injunction and said, looks like they're violating your prior injunction in this new Senate bill. So we went back with OCA as our client. We were successful, and they struck that language from the oath. So you no longer have to say that, right? And we were able to do that before the 2022 elections, right? And that's why the work that we're doing, it's important because we're able to go to court and get results for the community. Right? There's other provisions that I'm happy to talk about too that we're still going forward with. Trial is scheduled to start September 11th. So we're going forward with that lawsuit. We also have several other lawsuits. But language access is such a big part of the work that we do because in Texas, 43% of all voters that we surveyed were limited English proficient. So it's really important that we have language assistance. Okay, we asked folks, how do they identify, right? Do you identify as a Republican, a Democrat? Do you identify as not affiliated with any party or some other party? You can see nationally on the left, of all the about 5,500 voters that we surveyed all across the country, more than half identified as registered Democrats. 24% said not in any party, and 19% said Republican. Here in Texas, the numbers were very different. We had 35%, more than a third, identifying as Republican, 34%, very high number, with neither party, and 28% as Democrat. Right? Now, for Texas, it's not such a big deal to be not enrolled or not affiliated because you have open primaries. When you go for a primary election, you tell them which party's primary you want to vote in. It's called an open primary. That's good. There's no consequences really to be not affiliated or enrolled. In states where we have closed primaries, that's the state where I'm from, New York, you have to be enrolled in the party to vote in that party's primary. So when you have these large numbers, about a quarter nationwide that are not enrolled, in those closed primary states, they're cut out of the primary process. And as you know, in some places, the real race is the primary, right? And the community is shut out from that. So luckily in Texas, there's no serious negative consequences like there are in closed primary states. But it's also interesting to know, some people will refer to this unaffiliated group as up for grabs, right? They're not tied to one party, and they're willing to vote for any candidate depending on the issues. So when we broke it down by city, you can see very different numbers here. In Dallas, 73% identified as Republican, 17% not enrolled, a very small percent, only 5%. And again, it's very closely tied to the slide I showed you with the ethnic breakdown. Right? A lot of folks that we surveyed in Dallas were Vietnamese American, and many of them identified as Republican. In other places, in Frisco, is more of a mix. The largest group there was unaffiliated, 44%, right? Followed by Democrat at 33% and 22% Republican. Austin had the largest number of folks that identify as Democrat, 43%. So real differences geographically here in Texas, also with the ethnic groups, a lot of differences. So here we are with party enrollment by ethnicity here in Texas. You see the Vietnamese community on the bottom, 58%, the only group that was over 50% Republican. In Korean, Filipino, Pakistani, really high numbers of folks identify with the Democratic Party. But within all groups, that last section there, the green, very high numbers not enrolled in any party, which was really interesting. Right, we asked who'd you vote for a governor, right? And the numbers were pretty close to what the general electorate had for the entire state. So that number in the red, that's for the entire state, all voters. It was 55% to 44%. The numbers were pretty close within the Asian American community on that. One thing that's interesting to note, of all the states that we were in, the 12 states in Washington, D.C. for the 2022 election, Texas was the only state that had over 50% that voted for the Republican candidate for governor in all the gubernatorial elections that were happening. We asked who'd you vote for Congress. Now, one thing to note, this was not voters throughout the entire congressional district. This is only the voters at the poll sites that we were in those cities that were within those congressional districts. So of those voters that we surveyed at the poll sites within those congressional districts, you see the largest number was in Austin, 62% supported the Democratic candidate, and in Dallas, 85% supported the Republican candidate, only 9% for the Democratic candidate. So then we asked, we broke it down by ethnic group. And again, you see the same things throughout some of these slides. South Asian voters generally supported the Democratic candidate, and the Vietnamese and Chinese voters that we surveyed in the places that we were in Texas had the most support for Republican candidates for Congress, House of Representatives. We asked what were the top issues. What were the top issues that influenced your vote for House of Representatives? This is pretty consistent throughout. If you're interested, on our website, AALDEF.org, AALDEF.org, you can look at all of our reports going back to like 2002 we have on our website. And these top issues remain pretty much consistent. Usually top two, economy, jobs, education, healthcare. Nationally, public safety was the fourth one. Here in Texas, immigration, refugees was the fourth one, followed by gun control. One of the things that we do every survey, we ask these topical questions that's in the news. And again, our community, unfortunately, is not asked these questions, right? They're polling everybody else except us. So we want to be included in the conversation. So the language is taken from national polling questions, right? So the questions we had on this year's midterm election: do you approve or disapprove of the job Joe Biden is doing as president? Was the outcome of the 2020 presidential election legitimate? In the past 2 years, were you a victim of anti-Asian harassment or violence? Do you support laws to protect transgender people from discrimination? Do you support access to illegal abortion? Really topical questions that are in the news. We've had some Supreme Court cases on some of these issues. I want to reiterate that this survey that we're doing, it's nonpartisan. We're not steering people one way or the other. We just want to know where the community is on these issues, right? And report out on them. So here in Texas, only 33% approval for Joe Biden, with 44% disapproving, 24% saying they don't know. Very different numbers from the rest of the country, right? Much lower here. When you break it down by ethnic group, you can see the big differences, right? Vietnamese community, very low approval, only 11%. A whopping 65% disapproval, compared with the Filipino community, well over 50% approving. And other ethnic groups there, Asian Indian, again, about 50% approving, only 21% disapproving. Most of the groups still had a big percentage, about a fifth or a quarter, that said they don't know. One of my favorite slides. This one's really interesting. We cross-tabbed, so we took Joe Biden approval and crossed it with English proficient versus non-English proficient, right? So the LEP is limited English proficient, non-LEP is English proficient. Very big differences here. So in terms of approval, the English proficient voters in Texas, 47% approved compared to only 15% of the limited English proficient voters. And it's very similar with the disapproving. Only 29% of English proficient Asian American Texan voters disapprove of Joe Biden, and of the limited English proficient, you have 62%. Huge differences there depending on whether you're English proficient or limited English proficient. Same thing, very similar with foreign-born versus native-born. Right? We take a look at native-born, 55% approve compared to 42% that approve of foreign-born. And then with the disapproval, 23% native-born and 35%. Like really big differences. So who are the biggest supporters of Joe Biden? It's the native-born English proficient voters. The folks that disapprove the most are the foreign-born limited English proficient voters. Now this is very similar. We asked this question in 2018 for Donald Trump approval, and we saw the same thing where it was the foreign-born limited English proficient voters that had the largest support for Donald Trump, and it was the English proficient native-born that had the least support for Donald Trump. So the interesting thing here is, in a way, almost counterintuitive from what you may have heard this narrative on some conservative media that Democrats just want immigrants to come in because they're going to vote for Democrats. This is very counterintuitive to that, right? Contrary to that message, it is the foreign-born limited English proficient that has the least amount of support for Joe Biden. Interesting. Outcome of the 2020 presidential election, right? Do you consider it legitimate? Right. Overall in Texas, only barely over half said that the election was legitimate in 2020. 25% or 22% said no, and a full quarter said they don't know. Right. Versus you see the Korean, multiracial, Filipino, very large numbers saying that it was legitimate. Vietnamese voters, the largest amount, a full 37% said no, it was not legitimate, and 35% said they don't know if it was legitimate. Right? Very, very large numbers. Right. Very concerning, very sad number here about were you the victim of anti-Asian harassment or violence in the last 2 years. Right. So you see we have 14% here in Texas. Nationwide, the number was 22%, right? So more than a fifth, more than 1 out of 5 said yes. Again, only the last 2 years. We asked this in 2022. And in places like New York, it was even higher. Right? It's a very sad, concerning number, and hopefully that number will come down. But we want to report this out so folks know about what's happening. Do you support access to a legal abortion? More than half, 55%, said yes, they support. 30% said they do not support, and 50% said they don't know. Right? The number nationally was about 65% that supported. A little bit different here. Again, the ethnic breakdown, multiracial, 100% said they support. Right? And you can see on the way down, all the green is supporting, red is not supporting. So the Vietnamese community, again, a lot of overlap with party affiliation. More than half said they do not. Do you support laws to protect transgender people from discrimination? Again, more than half, 58%, right? A very strong number. Again, nationally, the number's a little bit higher. 58% said they do support those laws, and only 17% said they oppose. Again, we're taking this language, a little bit of a loaded question, but we're taking this language from national polling, right? So we can do an apples to apples comparison. Pretty same breakdown we see when you break it down by ethnic group. Again, the Vietnamese community with the largest opposition, and multiracial Filipino, South Asian voters with the most support. Here's the breakdown of the ages. We ask on our survey your age, your gender, if you identify as male, female, or non-binary. At the age distribution, it's pretty even there. You see the largest distribution was the 40 to 49 demographic at about a quarter. But pretty even distribution overall. We asked them on the survey too. I had mentioned that we do voter protection, right? Real-time voter protection. So if a voter has a problem, we asked on the survey, did you encounter any of the following? Right? And I do want to just go over some of the issues that we're looking for. We do a training before every election so our volunteers know what to look out for. There are some common problems that happen with Asian American voters almost every election. When our voters go to the table to sign in, many times they run into a problem. And there's a few reasons why. East Asia naming conventions. Usually there's 3 names. Many times on the voter roll, that gets inverted, right? So when they say, oh, my name is so-and-so, it's inverted in the voter roll so they can't find it, right? We also have sometimes harder to pronounce, unfamiliar names. So 1 or 2 letters will be incorrectly entered, and the poll worker has the discretion to determine, is it close enough, right? We also have an issue with hyphens, right? If there are hyphens, sometimes there's a hyphen on the voter roll, but no hyphen on the driver's license, or vice versa, right? And lastly, we have Anglo nicknames. A lot of folks will have an Anglo nickname, right? My actual name is Jerry, but a lot of us have Anglo nicknames. The Anglo nickname will be on the driver's license, but not on the voter roll, or vice versa, and that causes a problem many times, right? So when that happens, if the poll worker says, well, that's not close enough, sometimes our voters are turned away, and sometimes they're given a provisional ballot, right? You're supposed to be given a provisional ballot if there's any problem with that, right? So that will lead to problems, right, for our voters. We also have, unfortunately, sometimes voters are asked to prove their citizenship, right? It's like, you don't look like an American. What's an American supposed to look like? And this has literally happened in jurisdictions around the country to Asian American voters, especially LEP, first-time Asian American voters that are unfamiliar with the process. Now, how many people could prove their citizenship? How many people could prove their citizenship right now? Do you have anything? Some people might have something, but most people, especially when you go to vote, you don't have your birth certificate, your naturalization certificate, your passport, right? So that will be a way to turn away a voter. The other problem that happens is being prevented from receiving your language assistance, right? So if you come with someone, we still have some poll workers that will say you have to be a registered voter. Even though we won that case, we still have some poll workers that are mistaken and believe the old law is still in effect, right? So there's a lot of different ways that our voters can be disenfranchised or have a problem. Our goal on election day is if they run into any of those problems, we're able to remedy it right there in real time. Here's that list I was talking about that of covered jurisdictions, right? This is only for Asian languages. I didn't include the ones for Spanish, Native American, or Alaskan Natives. This is just for Asian languages. That list that comes out every 5 years, you can see here in Texas, I mentioned we have Dallas, Harris, and Tarrant, right? And the languages that are covered. If you take a look at that map, you'll see there's a lot of states or counties that are not covered, right? So our community many times will rely on bringing somebody with us. I should also note, even though a county or a jurisdiction is covered, doesn't mean that they're going to comply, right? It's onerous, it's hard. You have to translate everything. Some counties will just not do it. Some will use Google Translate and not have it checked. And I don't know if you ever used Google Translate. Tons of problems, right? You might get some ridiculous translations. Cook County, that's in Illinois, was covered for Chinese. We actually proofed one of their translations, and it said, when did you become a nuclear submarine? Can you imagine being an LEP and you're like, what does this mean, right? And the vote workers are, well, it's translated, what's the problem? That's a problem when you use Google Translate, right? So we want to make sure it has to be accurate and effective language assistance, right? So oral language assistance is included, so, all right, should we have Cantonese, should we have Mandarin, should we have Fujianese, or some other type of dialect? They need to work with community members to know what's the correct oral language assistance that's needed. It has to be effective. I'll just tell you briefly, we actually sued Hamtramck, Michigan. Hamtramck is right outside Detroit, a very big Bangladeshi and Yemeni population. They're covered. You see here, Michigan, Hamtramck is covered for Bengali, right? Or as Bangladesh. They've been covered for some time, and we had received reports from our exit poll, and that's how we are able to identify if the jurisdiction is compliant or not, that there's no Bengali ballots, there's no interpreters. So when we asked the clerk, he said, well, no one's asking for the Bengali ballots. I said, well, they don't know there's Bengali ballots, right? You're not making it available to them, so that's why they're not asking. We had to sue them in federal court. Within 30 days, they entered into a consent decree, which is basically an agreement, a settlement agreement that the court is ordering them to comply. The very next election, when they finally provided the Bengali ballots and Bengali interpreters, they elected the first Muslim American mayor to that city. The very next election. Do you see? It is a huge impact on voters, especially when so many voters are LEP within the community, right? So a place like Hamtramck, most of the time, South Asian voters have low LEP numbers with one exception, the Bangladeshi community. They have a very high LED number, right? So jurisdictions don't always comply. What's one way that we can assess whether they're complying or not? Through this exit poll. Right? We ask, did you have any access to translations, interpreters, and if we know they're covered, so when we're in Tarrant County, Dallas County, if folks are telling us in the exit poll there was no interpreters, the ballot wasn't translated, that's how we can know and follow up. And file a lawsuit if needed. Right? That's usually our last resort. We're usually trying to work cooperatively with the jurisdiction and have them comply without having to file a lawsuit. Right? Because we have limited resources. We do not like it. We don't want to have to file a lawsuit. We only do so if we think it's necessary. All right. So these are some of the more recently covered jurisdictions. You see Dallas is there. That was just in 2021. Tarrant was just in 2016. Philadelphia now is covered for Chinese, which is great. So I mentioned the Section 208 SB1, right? That was bringing somebody who brought lawsuits for both of those. Currently litigating. Redistricting. Does anyone know what redistricting is?
Yeah.
Right, so I think gerrymandering has been in the news, right? So some people know about that for political reasons. We could also have racial gerrymandering, where it has impacts or implications on communities. I want to show you a slide about, we have a lawsuit in Texas right now where we're challenging the state house, state senate, and congressional maps because they divide Asian American communities in numerous places. And I want to show you why that's so important. Let me pull up another slide here. Eugene, you know another, Eugene?
You just stepped out. Did you press F? Yeah.
南波没了，北方了，下次来吃。今天主要是给自己人吃。
对呀，生日以后没见这么久了。
Oh, there we go.
Yay.
Good job.
饥饿营销是吧？我说你搞饥饿营销是吧？
我是温州人。
吊胃口，你也这么说人吗？
So what we're looking at here, this is Sugarland. Okay, I wanted to show you this one because it's probably the most egregious, right, the worst ones. We have claims here in Dallas because the Federal Voting Rights Act it prohibits discrimination based on race, but it also it ensures that your right to vote is not denied or abridged because of your race. Right? So basically everyone in Texas, regardless of your race, should have an equal opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. Right? And with redistricting, what happens is you have to redraw all of the districts, state house, state senate, congressional, as well as other districts, every 10 years because of the census and people are moving and shifting. What you're seeing here, there's a few things that we have. This is in the Sugarland area. The blue line is the line that we drew with the community. We asked community members, what's the boundaries of your neighborhood? So one of the ones they said was Katy, Mission Bend, Sugarland. That's this blue line. They said that was like their community. Okay. The green, that's what we call a racial heat map. The darker the green is, the more concentrated, densely concentrated it is of Asian population. So dark green means a lot of concentration of the Asian population. The lighter it goes, the less concentrated it is. So you see, there's a lot of Asian population here, right? This is the Sugarland area. Over here, this is the Asia town in Houston. Right? This blue line, this is the county line, okay, between Harris and Fort Bend County. These black lines, let me zoom in a little bit more. That's the state senate lines that are drawn by the state legislature. Look how it goes right through the middle of this community and puts them into 3 different districts. So when you do this, if you drew it as the blue line is in one district, they could be a majority or a plurality, right? Either 40%, 50%, 60% of the district. what they did was they took a small piece from each of these areas and put them with a larger white population. So now they're only 5%, 10%, 15% of a district. So what happens when you're only 5 or 10 or 15% of a district? You can't win. If you all come out and vote for the same candidate and everybody else is voting for another candidate, you're going to lose every single time.
They put a voting ticket separate box.
So they're going to be in different districts,
Oh.
right? So this is, if they were all together in one district, everybody's together, hey, let's all go vote for one candidate.
Okay.
You could win, right? When you do this is called vote dilution. You're taking parts of the community and putting it with another community where there's more people in the other community, right? So they did this right here, pretty egregious, really bad. We do separate talks on redistricting. I say this every time, redistricting, the redrawing of the lines, that is the most effective voter suppression tool out there. Because so many, I don't know if you've worked with OCA or other groups, I know people do naturalization, right? Immigrants come, you want to naturalize them, help them naturalize. Then once they naturalize, you do voter registration, get them to register to vote. They say, come on, let's get out to vote, right? GOTV, you call them, you knock on the door. Then we have our exit poll, the voter protection, make sure that when they go to vote, that they're actually able to vote. All of that work goes out the window, down the drain, if you have lines like that. Because everybody could vote. Go ahead, everybody vote. You're only 5, 10, 50% of the district. You will never, ever win. You're not going to be able to elect a candidate of your choice. So that's why we brought this lawsuit. We want to stop things like this. So this is, I'm giving you this example because it was really bad. We had similar things happen all over the state of Texas for Asian American voters. Right? And guess what? Who was the fastest growing racial group in the state? Asian Americans. Right? Also in the country, the fastest growth rate was in the Asian community. What this does is it stops that growth, right? It turns it on its head and it says, even though you grew so much and now you can finally maybe be a majority in the district, we're going to draw it like this so that you'll still continue to be only a small percentage. Right? So that's why we brought that lawsuit. And who's our client? OCA Greater Houston. Debbie is an individual. Debbie Chen is our individual client. We have several other voters that are Asian American in the DFW area, in Sugar Land, in Houston, all across the state, where we have a large portion of Asian American voters. We have asserted claims to stop that. I want to be clear, we're not asking for special treatment or any advantage. We're asking an equal opportunity. Let us have an equal chance to vote and elect a candidate of our choice, and don't do things like this. So, the state senator who's in charge of redistricting said, well, we didn't look at race at all. We just threw this race blind. This is just a coincidence. just a coincidence. No. Right? And the Voting Rights Act, it used to be you had to show intent. You had to show that they intentionally did something like this. But in 1982, they changed the standard and said, no, you just have to show that the impact is going to discriminate against the voters, right? So that's our claim. That lawsuit should be going to trial in early 2024. And the shame is these lines have been in effect for the last several years. So you're having elections going forward with these illegal lines. Now we allege that they're illegal. Hopefully we'll be successful and stop this. But this happens all over the country. Because most folks, we don't have time to be involved in this. It's complicated, right? Drawing these lines for all the different levels. But I have to give credit to this community. Asian Americans came out in full force they had redistricting hearings, right? There was a group called Asian Texans for Justice.
Yeah.
And OCA and Engage and a lot of other groups that organized and testified. I don't know if any of you testified, but we testified. I signed up for New York to do his hybrid. They had in-person and Zoom, right? And they gave us a list. Okay, for all of you who signed up on Zoom, here's the list of Zoom speakers. Okay, I see this number, I know my turn, right? Once they started, they called the first person, you know what they called next? They jumped random. They didn't follow the list. So you know what that meant? You don't know if you're going next or if you're going in a few hours. I waited there for 8 hours to be called.
Wow.
Okay, and we had so many other folks that the same thing happened. And that was done on purpose. Right? Why give that? It deflates you. You don't want to participate again after that, right? And we had the same experience for people that were in person, right? They had a list of people that signed up, and they went completely random, calling people randomly. So you didn't know if you're going next or in several hours. So the process was really bad, but substantively, they divided the community in a way that we allege is illegal. The Voting Rights Act is supposed to stop things like this from happening. So we'll see where that lawsuit goes. This is the work that we do here. We're trying to protect and empower the community. Again, not trying to have any type of advantage. We want just equal voice, right? Equal chance to participate in voting. The work that we do on election day is really important. I'm going to ask you all just to consider for 2024, consider volunteering with us on election day. It's one of the best things you can do, especially if you have language ability. You can help your community. Right? You can help your community, and our minimum commitment is nationally it's 3 hours. I think here, Debbie was saying it's 4 hours. You try to do 1 4-hour commitment. So you do a shift during the election day, and you can do other things, right? But when you're with us, you have to be nonpartisan, right? We're not advocating for or against any party or any candidate. We just want to capture the data and make sure everybody can vote. And I want to be clear here also, we do the training on voters' rights on election day. The survey we only do for Asian American voters because we're not being included in other polling. So the survey is really only for Asian American voters. Voter protection is for all voters. Any voter, regardless of race, if they have a problem, and we're there to help them and make sure they're able to